Hi everyone, welcome to session 19, Punishment and Learned Helplessness. We'll be covering the topic of punishment over the next couple of sessions. And it's also covered in Beyond Freedom and Dignity's chapters 4 and 5, in which Skinner provides a fairly thought-provoking essay on the history of punishment, why it's used so much, and why we continue to use punishment when there are clear alternatives to using punishment, and how theories of freedom and dignity might actually give rise to those very punitive kinds of measures, or at least the perpetuation of these practices. In the meantime, we're just going to cover really the basics of punishment, the positions, Skinner's position, Azrin's position, and functional definitions versus operational definitions of punishment, and a variety of other things such as variables which may actually govern the effectiveness of punishment. For the start of this, what I'd like you to do for a moment, this is actually might be considered a more psychoanalytic time of these sessions. I want you to think back into your childhood, and I want the first thing that pops up in your head of a time in which you were punished. Now think about this for a second, and you got to be brutally honest with yourself here. I mean, many things pop up, but what was the first thing when I asked you a time in your life when you were punished? What I'd like you to think about is what you did that got punished. Okay, what was it? What was the thing that really irked either your parents, maybe your significant other, somebody else in your environment, your boss or somebody that actually got them very angry, whatever it was. Okay, now that you know what that behavior is, what was the punishing stimulus? Okay, got it? And then I want you to think about what effect did that punishing stimulus have on your behavior? Did it decrease future probabilities of you doing this particular behavior? Okay. That is, did you stop doing it? Did you do it less often? Did you find ways to actually continue doing the behavior but find ways to avoid punishment? That is, you just did it in a sneakier manner and just didn't get caught from that point on. More importantly, think about this. The behavior that you actually engaged in prior to being punished, is that a behavior that was actually reinforcing? I mean, were you having fun doing it? Or was it something that you were coerced into doing? And, did punishment actually change how you felt about that particular event? You might not have done it as often, but when you did do it, was it still reinforcing? These are the variables to think about whenever we use punishment. And it's going to vary from incident to incident, from punisher to punisher, from person to person, and so forth and so on. I could certainly think about things in my lifetime that were very, very punishing. But that's not usually the first thing that pops up into my head. Some of the things that pop up into my head were the people who actually delivered the punishers. Not that I was punished a lot in my childhood. I wasn't, maybe not that much. But anyway, the point here is that we're going to cover this topic. We're going to cover Skinner's position, and we're also going to cover Azrin's position and some of the research in the area of punishment, both in this session and next session. So I'm going to go ahead and freeze my camera. Hang on here a second. I've got a brand new system here that UC Denver has provided, so make sure I can do this right. So I'm going to freeze. Okay, I've got my pointer, which is a new pointer. I can't scroll it around and make everybody nauseous. Now I have to just kind of point it into a position. Okay, let's get started. All right, so a couple of questions. Why is punishment prevalent in different cultures? That is, we have certainly versions of punishment. Other cultures have less severe forms of punishment, maybe more severe forms of punishment, but punishment seems to be pervasive across many different cultures. And one of the reasons Skinner points out that this is so is that it has immediate effects. That is, when you think about it, think about how long it takes for positive reinforcement to actually go into place. I mean, we have to certainly look at a behavior. To increase a behavior, we have to study it. We have to get an operant level, a baseline, right? We have to find out what might be a positive reinforcer. We have to make sure that there are establishing operations in the environment so that when we use these things as positive reinforcers, they don't have free access to it. The fact that they can only get it by engaging in a contingent activity of some sort or a reinforcing activity allows us to be able to provide positive reinforcement to strengthen a behavior. All of these things have to go into play before you actually start using positive reinforcement, at least, really effectively. On the other hand, with the use of punishment, you don't have to worry about these things. You don't have to be deprived of punishment to make a punisher necessarily work. And a lot of times, parents will go to probably the most immediate thing available to them to actually get a person to change their behavior. And this is a topic that, again, comes up again and again in Skinner's Beyond Freedom and Dignity, but we bring it up here too, that many of the reasons why we engage in behaviors towards other people, whether it's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, or punishment, a lot of that has to do with the immediacy of the effect. And it turns out if you got a kid who's running around in circles in a store and you are telling them, please stop, please stop, please stop, but they are not paying attention to you and they keep running, a parent resorting to punishment might spank their child, and the child just simply stops running and drops to the ground. Again, it's the immediate effect. The parent wanted the cessation of that particular behavior. And unfortunately, punishment is one of those ways in which it's oftentimes achieved. In other words, at the moment that a child might be misbehaving, that might set up a set of negative reinforcement conditions for the person who is delivering the punishing agent. Okay? So in other words, you're the parent, your child's running around the store yelling and screaming, you're trying your best to redirect them, it's not working, and everybody around you is staring at you. So the level of aversiveness in this situation is rising and rising and rising. And therefore, now that you engage in delivering a punisher, your child immediately stops engaging in that particular behavior. And that's what strengthens your behavior. The immediate removal of what your child is doing that is so aversive is such a powerful negative reinforcer for you that this is why it sustains the operant response, which happens to be punishment. Okay? And so many parents have been in that situation. So when you do that to your child, a lot of times other parents will look at you and understand what you're going through, perhaps, because they themselves use the same techniques to control their children. Okay? Also, with punishment, deprivation is not necessarily an effective treatment to have to put into place for punishment to work. Remember, you have to be deprived or at least not gain access to the positive reinforcer for it to be effective. Okay, that doesn't necessarily happen with punishment. You don't have to say to yourself, well, it's been a long time since I've stuck a fork in a wall socket. This might be fun. And then you start sticking a fork in the wall socket and punishing yourself. You don't do that. And the fact that you haven't actually engaged in that behavior, perhaps except when you were a child, you might have been exploring, you stuck something in the wall socket and got shocked. It's been a long time since that has happened, but that doesn't necessarily have to happen in order for punishment to work. You could be shocked yesterday, and it's, again, not much deprivation there either. So deprivation is one of those agents you don't have to factor in. Punishment is almost like one of those biological predispositions that we have to respond to certain kinds or a class of aversive stimuli. All right. There are byproducts of punishment, and Skinner points some of these out. One of them is that it gives rise to a great deal of respondent behaviors, or what we might call emotion. That is, there are elicited behaviors that people engage in when they are confronted with punishment, and that competes with operant behavior, and it looks like it's actually suppressing behavior. Think back to the example I just mentioned here. A child who's running around the store is just punished, and now they're on the floor at the store, maybe crying and holding on to their fanny and so forth. So we see here is that the elicited behavior from the punishment actually gives rise to behaviors that compete with the operant behavior. If you're on the floor holding your fanny, you're not necessarily running around the store. These seem to be somewhat competing behaviors, not necessarily incompatible. I mean, I have seen parents spank their children, and then the children runs around the store now, and instead of laughing, now they're crying holding their fanny. So Sometimes it doesn't always compete. There are times, though, in which, though, the elicitation of emotional or respondent behaviors are so overpowering that they appear to actually suppress behavior. We're going to talk about this in a second, such as a situation in which you are so fearful that you just freeze and you don't move, okay? And that behavior actually may compete in time in which, when you have to make an escape response and the stimulus actually gives rise to freezing, you can't freeze and make an escape response at the same time. And that's what we're going to talk about shortly when we talk about learned helplessness. And then finally, predisposition to aggress towards punishing agents, right? Those people who are punished necessarily give rise to some elicited behaviors, which might not necessarily decrease the inappropriate behavior and actually might lead to directed aggression towards the people who are punishing. And certainly this rises in the literature. We see oftentimes this country attacked this country and then they turned and retaliated. We certainly see in the history of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and how these things seemingly are justified in certain cultures. However, we certainly see that one of the dispositions that happen when you try to punish one agent, they try to turn around and return the punishment. Okay. We also see here that there's a predisposition that when we are punished, that we will also escape from punishing agents. Okay, so it gives rise to actually a couple of things happening here. When we are confronted with an aversive event, we could, number one, aggress towards those punishers. Number two, we could run away from those punishing agents, flee, right, or fight. And then we certainly see here that children who were punished may run away from home. I think I did that one time. It didn't last long. I think about a half hour, or at least until I got sick in the back seat of my mother's car. I ran away from home, and I think I remember leaving home and taking with me some of my most important possessions. It might have been my stuffed animal. It might have been a picture book, Peter Rabbit or something like that. And I think I went into the kitchen and grabbed the first thing I could find, which was actually a big jar of orange Tang. You know that powdered drink, that stuff that the astronauts took with them to the moon? Well, Dr. Kupfer took the Tang with him to the back seat of his mother's car and ran away from home for about 20 minutes and ate half the jar of Tang and threw up all over the back seat of his mother's car. And that is my one thing I think about at a time at which I was punished, that particular event. Don't know why that comes up. Maybe it's because it might have been, sad at the time. Maybe in retrospect it might have been funny that there was some justice there. My parents punished me. Now I seem to have gotten back at them by getting sick in the backseat of the car. Don't know. But we certainly see this kind of behavior happening. Children do run away from home. And when people are in cultures or societies that are overly punitive, there is defection. There is the desire to leave a country and start anew into another country which is free of tyranny and punishing stimuli. Let's go over an experiment by Marty Seligman, in which he noted that many of the patients that he had been working with or studying report a lot of times that when they are depressed, they feel a lot of times that they are helpless. And in this situation, Seligman defined helplessness as something that results when outcomes occur independent of all operant or voluntary responses. Okay, I'm going to show you something here, which is sort of like similar to what I showed you in the operant conditioning section, but it's sort of reversed here. That is that this axis in that contingency space in that particular chapter, I think this axis was up here and this axis was down here. But the main thing this is showing you here is the probability of outcome given a particular response. So you see here on the bottom here, the probability of outcome given a response, and when you see that it's a 1.0 probability, every time there's a response, there's a particular outcome, right? It shows you that that's continuous reinforcement. When you see here that sometimes a response produces an outcome and sometimes not, you can see here that anywhere between 0 and 0.1 is partial or intermittent reinforcement. All right. Now over on this side is what you see here is that there's an outcome that's contingent and only happens when there is no response. You see that R? Oh, let me see there. The R bar right there, that means no response. And when you have a situation in which all reinforcement is delivered when no response occurs, 1.0, this is a DRO schedule. That is, it reinforces the absence of a response. Sometimes you could have situations in between in which sometimes not responding doesn't give you a reinforcer, sometimes it does. Now, at this point right here in the middle is the point of what we call response independence. That is, there is just as much probability of an outcome for behaving as not behaving. And right here is the situation in which behavior has no actual outcome. This is what Seligman's talking about, in which operant behavior, the outcome, occurs independent of voluntary responses. But in the situation that Seligman was studying, he wasn't studying outcomes of positive reinforcement. He was actually studying the outcome of whether an animal can or cannot control aversive events in their lives. And he pointed out an interesting thing that I'm not sure if many people really understand about depression, that it can be looked at several ways. One way is the way that we typically look at depression, in which it refers to passive individuals who believe that they cannot do anything to relieve their suffering, such as losing an important source of nurturance and so forth. And we see people who really feel like they can't do anything, and therefore a lot of times they have what might be called depressed behavior. Right? And in that sense, depressed behavior in Skinner's writing is an appropriate actual term to use. It is as if operant behavior is depressed. That is, something is pressing down on the level of operant behavior and keeping it from rising up. And if you think about it, it's an interesting analogy, because what a lot of times people find when they are depressed is they can't do much of anything. They can't go to work, they can't eat, they lose their appetite, they can't sleep, so forth and so on, and they have somewhat more of a lower level of behavior. On the other hand, we've seen something else interesting happen too. That is, in these situations in which we are confronted with things that we can not control independently, it also means that we could see some people become actually agitated. That is a heightened level of behavior in which these patients make active responses, okay, and they seem to become depressed when there are no external causes. This kind of depression, by the way, is something that we've come to call agitated depression. And you can actually get something which appears as if they're very revved up and anxious and so forth, but it turns out that a lot of times you could get both of these kinds of behaviors, somewhat depressed and somewhat agitated, in the clinical diagnosis of depression. So what Seligman asked is helplessness a psychological phenomenon, or is it the result of a physical deficit of some sort or another? And he set up a very clever experiment that we're going to go over now, which was called the triadic design. And this is going to be one of two experiments I'm going to describe here. This is called the active response. Now, this is a little bit complicated, but it's a very clever way of actually addressing a question related to treatment of three different groups, and how we could control these differences, hold constant certain variables, and compare the effect of whether your behavior is independent or dependent, and what the outcome is in terms of making an escape response. So what we have here are three groups of subjects. Okay, actually there were three groups of dogs, and group number one received a pre-treatment which involves an outcome that could actually be controlled by pressing the nose against the panel. So what you have here is a seeming, as an operant chamber. There is a grid floor in the chamber, and then on occasions, a mild electrical brief shock will be delivered on the floor, and it will stay on. And on the front panel, there is a simple manipulanta that all the dog has to do is walk up to the front panel and push its nose against this panel that's mounted there, and they turn off the electric shock. In other words, for group one, they have learned an active way of escaping electric shock. Okay? For group two, these subjects, these dogs, the events that happened to them were yoked to group one. In other words, group two did not have an escape opportunity. That is, they were in an identical chamber as group one. However, on the front panel, there was no operant manipulanda that the dogs could press in order to turn off the electric shocks. So in other words, the shock came on exactly at the same time that the shock came on for this group. So in other words, one dog from group 1 was exposed to this condition, and a dog from group 2 was yoked to that same dog in group 1. Another dog in group 1 was yoked to yet another dog in group 2. So whenever the shock came on for one dog, it came on immediately for the matched yoked dog. As soon as this dog in group 1 turned off shock by making a successful escape response, group 2, that dog had shock removed from his side of the chamber, or her side of the chamber. Okay. In other words, in both group 1 and group 2, both of these dogs had the same exact amount of electric shock as their matched or yoked counterpart. So if we see any differences between group 1 and group 2, we can't say that it was because the group 2 received more shock than group 1, or that group 2 received a longer duration of electric shock than group 1. In other words, these variables were held constant across these two groups. And here, group 3 did not receive this active treatment at all. Okay? Now, here was the experiment. There was going to be a new task for escape behavior that was going to be introduced to group 1, group 2, group 3. Okay? This is 24 hours later after all of these animals had received this training. And what the experiment involved was that this was called a shuttle box jump, in which there was the same type of experimental chamber for the dog. Electric shock would be turned on, but rather than having a panel, you can see here a panel, that was the escape response, the new response is that the dog had to jump from one side of this box over to another side of the box, in which there was no shock. Okay, so that's called the shuttle box jump. Shock on one side, the dog climbs over the little wall there, goes over to the other side, and it's an area in which it's shock-free. And the test was that we may go actually back and forth now, shock one side, and the dog learned readily to jump back and forth. Okay, so group 1 were exposed to the new task, group 2 was exposed to this task, and group 3 was exposed to this task. Remember, group 3 had never received the training of 1 or the yoke condition of 2. For group 3, this is the first time they ever encountered anything which was an escape response. Okay? And again, this is the direct test of the hypothesis. It is not the shock itself, but learning that shock is uncontrollable that causes helplessness. And what found out in this experiment was that when it came time to do the shuttle box jump, group 1 actively made the escape. Group 3 also learned to make that shuttle box jump. Group 2 failed to learn how to make the escape response. Okay? In that instance, what Seligman said was that group 2 had developed what is called learned helplessness. That is, they had learned during their situation that nothing they could do would make any difference in terms of the outcome to shock. Why? Because the outcome of shock was determined by another variable that we know to be the success or failure of the dog in group 1. Now, it turns out in thinking about this that maybe what might have happened in this experiment, and I believe this was Seligman's graduate student, who theorized that maybe group 2 couldn't do anything, so what group 2 actually learned to do was to do something that many organisms do when they are confronted in an adverse situation. Rather than moving around, just crouch, freeze, and not move. Okay? That is, the shock is going to come on, just take the shock, sit there, bear with it, hang in there, and as soon as the shock goes off, it goes off. In other words, maybe these animals might have seemingly gotten some sort of superstitious type of reinforcement or negative reinforcement by just crouching and freezing. So now when they have to learn a new shuttle box jump, which is an active response, they can't do it because they have a history of crouching and freezing. So the experiment that was designed to test this was develop something called a passive response. That is, it is the same general procedure that we just went through in terms of group 1, group 2, and group 3. Okay? Now what happened here was that what group 1 had learned to do in this new experiment was to learn a passive response. And in this case, rather than learning to press the front panel over here, like group 1, I'll go back to this, group 1 had to press its nose against the panel. That was the escape response. Well, in this new experiment, with a whole new set of subjects, group 1 dogs had to actually hold their head still. Okay. So in other words, rather than having an active response, they had to learn a passive response, which they believed was something which was similar to actually crouching and freezing. And that's what they taught here. Teach the animal to minimize movement and not move. And when the dog doesn't move in group 1, and when shock comes on, and group 1 dog doesn't move, he turns off electric shock, and then does so for his yoke counterpart. Okay, so now, again, passive response, same situation here for the yoke dog, and group 3 receives no pretreatment. And when you do this experiment, again, with the shuttle box jump, group 3 learned to jump very quickly, just like in the first experiment. Group 1, interestingly enough, did not move around much at first. They looked for some passive response to escape shock. In other words, what they would do is they tried the first one, which was hold your head still. If that didn't work, that behavior seemingly just slowly underwent extinction, and then there was just variation on a basic theme. Move a little bit and freeze over here. Move a little bit, tiny bit, freeze again. In other words, there was a variation in the type of freezing that group 1 actually did. But after a period of time, all of these passive ways simply underwent extinction, and failing to find any way to get out, variability set in, and group 1 began to jump over the other side of the box, the shuttle box, to escape. Once again, group 2, the yoke group, remained helpless during this entire test. What kind of shows you is that it's not learning a passive response. It seems to be learning that your behavior has no effect over the contingent relationship of shock being turned off by an escape response. Let's go over a couple of experiments now. This was an experiment done in 1938 by Skinner, in which he studied the punishment of lever pressing in rats. In the first phase of this experiment, this again is another group design. Actually, this is one of those times in which we have several group design experiments. I mentioned to you, we don't do group design research a whole lot in behavior analysis. The vast majority of it is actually single subject design. But this is an example, just like the Seligman experiment is an example of a group design. The other experiment that we went over and talked about in the errorless discrimination procedure was a group design. And yet this is yet another one. I think after this, most of them, though, are probably single subject. So group 1, or I should say both groups, were trained on a fixed interval 2-minute schedule in which food was delivered for first response after every 2 minutes. Okay, just a simple FI2. For phase 2, group 1 just simply underwent an extinction procedure in which it's just nothing more than disconnecting the wire from the lever to the pellet magazine dispenser. So the rat is now pressing the lever, but simply nothing is happening. No food is being delivered. So group 1 just simply went through FI2 followed by an extinction procedure. For group 2, it consisted also of an extinction procedure. Okay, so in that sense, group 1 and group 2 experienced the same contingency. Both of them underwent extinction. Okay, but for the first 10 minutes of the experiment for group 2, not only was extinction into place, Skinner introduced something called the bar slap. What is that? No, that's not when you go into a bar and deliver a line to somebody, turn around and slap you across the face. I hope you've never experienced that. I certainly have never experienced that, and I don't know if Skinner has, but for him, the bar slap was something different. It involved that the lever, every time it was pressed down, he attached to it a spring mechanism so that pressing down the lever resulted in a counter spring action, which caused the lever to spring upward. That's the bar slap. Okay? So the rat comes along, presses the lever down, and all of a sudden, as soon as it reaches its lowest level, pressing down, it all of a sudden activates another counter spring, which causes the spring to snap back up, and the rat essentially kind of, falls back off of the lever. Now Skinner labeled this as a punishing event, and he used this punisher in addition to extinction. So the thing he was looking at here was what effect is the use of punishment on reinforced behavior that's undergoing extinction. In other words, using an extinction procedure over a period of time, the operant behavior would undergo extinction and get less and less and less, and eventually just, go away. What effect is it that if we add to it a punishment procedure, what happens to the decline, the response deceleration over time in comparison to just simple extinction? And he found an interesting result. This is, by the way, a cumulative graph in which, rather than response stepping up the pen and resetting every time something happens, this is just simply looking at the cumulative responding over time. And this is the first day of the sessions, and as time passes, you can see here on day 1, the group right here, this group right up here, is the extinction procedure group, the ones in group 1 that just simply underwent extinction. And you can see here, this is just a simple classic extinction curve. For group 2, you see here for the first 10 minutes, extinction plus bar slap. And you see under this procedure, you get almost instantaneous response suppression. Right? Then after 10 minutes, Skinner removed the bar slap, part of the experiment, and then from that point on, group 1 and group 2 had the identical contingency, which is essentially extinction. And you could see here, as things progressed for group 2, response rate had started picking up, right? Picking up. And then by the end of the first day, if you look at the cumulative number of responses between group 1 and group 2, you would conclude that group 1 had more responding than group 2, and that in fact, group 2, the group that experienced punishment and extinction, their behavior decreased quicker, okay, over the course of that one day. That is, they emitted as a group far less responses than group 1 did. However, what Skinner did was to keep these records in place, just turn everything off, put the rats in the chamber, and bring them down the next day and run group 1 and group 2 again under those conditions. And now you see something interesting happening here. At the very beginning, you still had this difference here between group 1 and group 2, but as the session continued over time, look what happens over time. That is, the group that got punished, by the end of the session of day 2, they had caught up to group 1. And this had really profound effect on Skinner's thinking about the whole notion of punishment. That is, he noted here that by the end of the second day of testing, both groups of rats had emitted the same amount of responses, and you could clearly see that here. So what he was led to believe was that punishment actually, maybe I think I might have skipped the slide here. Yeah, we did. Punishment actually is not a behavioral process as we might think about with reinforcement or extinction. He believed punishment was actually the delivery of a stimulus that gives rise to incompatible behaviors. So when you see an actual decrease in operant behavior, it's because the punishing stimulus actually gives rise to behaviors that suppress operant behaviors. Okay? In doing so, Skinner defined punishment not functionally, he defined it operationally, and he went ahead to define 2 types of punishment. The first one is called type 1 punishment. That is the one that we typically think about, the presentation of an aversive event. That is, somebody's engaged in a behavior, they are confronted with the presentation of some sort of event, typically it's an aversive event, and as a result of that, that disrupts the operant behavior. Okay? That's type 1 punishment. Another type of punishing stimulus he described as type 2, the removal of a positive reinforcer. That is, you're engaged in the behavior, and then contingent on that response, a reinforcer is removed from you. Okay? And that seemingly interferes with the ongoing operant behavior, suppresses it. So when we think of type 1 punishment, we oftentimes think about the classic contingent aversive event. That is, the spanking, the punch in the head headlock, the electric shock. When behavior happens, it comes in contact with the stimulus, it's the presentation of it, and there you go, there's type 1. With type 2, you're engaged in behavior and something's removed. For example, if you are speeding, you get a ticket, and that removes positive reinforcement in the form of you have to pay a fee or a fine and so forth and so on. Both of these 2 procedures, Skinner said, are operationally defined in the sense that he defined punishment by the operation, presentation of adverse event or removal of a positive reinforcer. He didn't define it as the effect of a decrease in the behavior. Again, this is one of the things that he believed. He believed that punishment, in fact, is not really long-lasting in its effect, unlike reinforcement, and the effect is best described really as response suppression, not truly response elimination. And this kind of makes sense if you think about this. Is that it doesn't sometimes eliminate responding. Sometimes when we deliver these punishing stimuli, it may suppress it momentarily, but as soon as those punishing stimuli or anything associated with them are gone, it seems like the behavior comes back. It doesn't really eliminate it. And if you think about this, this may be true, is that sometimes people know that when they reach a certain age, what they used to get punished for, now that you are, an adult and society considers you an adult, now you may go back and engage in those same behaviors, perhaps a little bit more carefully, but again, it really didn't eliminate the behavior. It might have momentarily suppressed it. Okay? So what Skinner kind of concluded again is that the immediate effects of punishment are really a byproduct of an increase in incompatible respondent behavior. Okay? Now, that being the case, Skinner describes alternatives to punishment. And again, these are seemingly outlined in the Beyond Freedom Dignity chapter, right after punishment, the alternatives to punishment. Number one is extinction. That is, in order to really eliminate a behavior, why don't you address, or why don't we address, the maintaining variables? That is, if we know what is reinforcing about it and the events which establish and maintain the behavior using reinforcers, we know something in the scientific sense of how to adjust an operant behavior via the reinforcement contingency. And I'm going to come back and talk about this a little bit more in one of the next upcoming sessions. But one good way to do it is that if you could break the reinforcement contingency, you have an extinction procedure. That is over here, if you look back at this with the effect of punishment, obviously it suppressed it, but it didn't suppress it in the long run. However, what you do see here is this overall decrease over time in the rate and of the emitted responding. And why is that happening? Because of extinction. So he believes that the way to get at the behavior more effectively, one way is extinction. The second way is to condition incompatible behavior. That is, reinforce another behavior that is incompatible with that particular response. Okay? So if we give alternatives to an operant behavior, rather than having to punish the operant behavior out because it may have bad side effects, it hurts persons, it hurts other people, if we know the conditions under which the response is emitted and know why the person may be engaged in that behavior, we could give and shape up a whole lot of other incompatible alternative responses that will seemingly compete sometimes with those other behaviors. And that might be a way to actually eliminate behavior. Now, this is sort of the strategy that we go through when we talk about replacement behavior training, and that's something you will be learning extensively over the next couple of courses when we get to using applied behavior analysis and using some of the outcomes of our functional assessments and functional analyses. So again, if we're looking at replacement behavior training, a lot of that comes out of a lot of the early work of Skinner, which he said that rather than using punishment, we ought to be actually teaching, not just simply suppressing and eliminating responding, but actually moving behavior in another direction, which is less detrimental to the individual and society. Again, you'll cover a lot of the implications of this particular variable here in Beyond Freedom and Dignity. A third way is satiation. That is, after a period of time, the reinforcing event won't become reinforcing. So you allow the behavior to essentially peter out on its own using simple satiation procedures. And again, you'll go through some of these procedures in later courses. So again, as I mentioned, each of these alternatives are utilized in some way in functional relationship analysis and in replacement behavior training, because at the same time we reinforce replacement behaviors, we also stop reinforcing some of those problematic behaviors. In other words, we place those behaviors under extinction by learning what are the variables which establish, maintain those behaviors. we find those variables, we teach staff and caregivers to no longer provide reinforcement, either positive or negative reinforcement for those behaviors, in that sense weakening the contingencies of reinforcement, maintaining it, and then simultaneously establishing many more alternatives to compete with that problematic behavior. Right. Now, for a period of time, Skinner's position was believed to be pretty interesting in the sense that unlike positive reinforcement and reinforcement in general, which was defined functionally, he really did not push the functional definition for punishment. And then along came Azrin, who did an interesting study with pigeons in which he studied the long-term suppression of responding. In the first phase of this experiment, he ran pigeons and shaped up responding on key pecking on a VI 1-minute schedule of food presentation. On the schedule again, the first response on the average after 1 minute produces pigeon grain. So that was the first part of the experiment for the pigeons. In phase 2, he used something called a conjoint schedule. And we didn't cover this under schedules, but there is a definition that I did provide for you in that section. And a conjoint schedule just simply describes a situation in which there are 2 or more schedules that may be operating simultaneously. However, one manipulanda controls 2 different outcomes. Okay, it's not like respond on this key over here, you got one schedule, respond on a second key over here, you got another schedule. In this situation, there is one key, and responding to that one key produces 2 outcomes. The first outcome is that for these pigeons, he adjusted the schedule from VI1 to VI6. That is, instead of getting food on the average every 1 minute, on the average, food was delivered approximately every 6 minutes. In other words, he adjusted the schedule so that there was a lower frequency of reinforcement for that particular response. Okay, so VI1 to VI6. That in and of itself might actually alter and change the rate of responding. Okay. The second thing he did was that from now on, every single key peck delivered, FR1, a delivery of electric shock to the pigeon. He started off at for the pigeons at a small intensity electric shock of 30 milliamps per second. Okay. And then shifted to phase 2. Okay, and in this situation, it was the same as, phase 3. It was the same as phase 2, except phase 3, he just increased the amplitude of the electric shock. And what you see here is that this is responding on cumulative records, and what you see here is some of the classic VI performance in which no punishment is delivered. When you introduce the conjoint VI6 coupled with FR1 shock, you see that you get very quick suppression of operant behavior. The rate of responding goes down very, very rapidly. Okay? And then he went to phase 3, again, the no punishment condition, and now increased the amperage of the electric shock. And what you see here is very severe punishment and virtual complete suppression. Not 100%, because what you see here are flat lines, and every once in a while, there's a key peck with a delivery of reinforcement. No behavior for a long period of time. All right? No behavior for a long period of time, and all of a sudden, there's one key peck, shock, suppression. And again, no behavior for a period of time. Emit that one response because the VI timer probably timed out, and so forth. Now, this kind of shows you that you get very rapid suppression of responding, and it gets even more rapid with the increase in the intensity of the electric shock. But what Azrin found most important is that after running the pigeons in this particular experiment, and particularly the birds that had the very severe punishment, he brought the birds back up to their home chambers and never ran the experiment for approximately 6 months. So for a 6-month period, these pigeons never were exposed to an operant conditioning chamber, never exposed to pigeon grain delivered on a variable interval schedule, never receiving shock. This is all going on for 6 months. And then after 6 months, he brought the pigeons back down to the chamber, and he still had the pigeons not responding, still showing this kind of performance. even after 6 months of not being run. And this is one of the reasons why Azrin believed that in this situation, in which, unlike Skinner, in which you got rats that established what we call response recovery, in some instances you don't get response recovery, and you can get long-lasting suppression. So based on this particular reason, Azrin believed that punishment and behavior analysts ought to provide a functional definition of punishment, not just an operational one, but a functional one. And he defined it as a reduction in the future probability of a specific response as a function of the immediate delivery of a stimulus for that response. When we see this instance take place, that we demonstrate that there has been a decrease in the future probability contingent upon the delivery of a particular stimulus on that response, we say that that stimulus is defined functionally as a punishing stimulus, and we call the process punishment. And in this way, we have a very clear balance of functional definitions with regards to reinforcing events and punishing events. Punishment is not defined in terms of feelings or pain, although many of the things that, when they are delivered to us contingent on our behavior and it suppresses our behavior, we oftentimes will emit a verbal response that accompanies that stimulus. We will say, that hurts, that's painful, ouch, dang. And depending on what other social agents around us, we may choose another colorful word or two, such as when we drop something or hit our toe, like when we, we're walking at night and bang our toe on the nightstand. I don't know if you've had kids, but perhaps you've had the joy at 3 in the morning going to the bathroom and walking to the bathroom and accidentally stepping on a Lego. That's not fun at all. And dang is not the first thing that comes out of my mouth. In any event, it may be a punishing stimulus, and it certainly is in the sense that it suppresses certain kinds of behavior, such as walking in the dark. I'm much more careful. I might pick a different bathroom, right? I may actually turn on a light. In other words, whatever the event was, I'm going to change it in some way so I decrease the probability of engaging that behavior again. Okay? Interestingly enough, by the way, punishment oftentimes sets up negative reinforcement to happen. You contact the punisher, now you know there's something out there to avoid. You got to figure out what it is that successfully decreases the probability of punishers. And a lot of times that's engaging in smart alternative behaviors. Okay. And finally, a specific event must produce a specific response. Okay. That's one of the important features here, that we're able to identify that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the event and the specific response. That is, response produces the event. And like in positive reinforcement, we had unconditioned positive reinforcers and conditioned reinforcers. Similarly, we have unconditioned punishing stimuli. These are stimuli which result in a decrease in the future probability of a specific response without prior conditioning history. These are probably the big ones that usually involve electric shock or other things which impinge upon the skin. And at a very early age, things that are way too hot, things that are way too cold, right? And so forth. So these are things that we are biologically predisposed to respond to. We also have what are called conditioning punishing stimuli. These are stimuli which are paired with unconditioned punishers, and they themselves will also result in a decrease in responding. That is, you could have neutral stimuli that, when they are paired with these unconditional stimuli, right, unconditioned stimuli, these now will also exert a decrease in the future probability of response contingent on that behavior. Go through an experiment with you, the last experiment for this session, by Hake and Azrin, in which they established what's called a conditioned punishing stimulus. In this experiment, the pigeons keep pecking were shaped and reinforced according to a variable interval 2-minute schedule. Again, the first response, on the average after 2 minutes, produces pigeon grain. In phase 2, while this was ongoing in phase 1 and the pigeons responding away, getting food on the average every 2 minutes, the conditioned suppression procedure was introduced, in which randomly in the experiment, while the pigeon was responding, a clicker sound, an auditory clicker sound, would come on in the chamber, and the key color that the pigeon was responding on would change. and then electric shock would be delivered shortly thereafter. In other words, they were pairing this click, 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 click with a change in key color, and then that would go on for a couple of seconds, and then again the delivery of electric shock. That's the condition suppression portion of the experiment. And what you end up seeing in a lot of the times in these experiments is that you see this, when it's a VI 2 minute, you see this nice stream of ongoing rate of behavior, and as soon as this pairing and clicking starts happening, the rate of responding starts tapering off. That's the condition suppression effect. Then we come to phase 3. After they go through this conditioning, right, that this happens and comes on, now you come to the conjoint part of the experiment. Remember, we have VI 2 minute food, but now fixed ratio 1 produces condition punishing stimulus, that's this noise, and it's followed by electric shock. Okay, so up here, this was just simply superimposed on top of this schedule, and there was nothing that the pigeons could really do about this. This was just simply going to happen as part of the conditioning. Now in phase 3, the pigeon's key pecking actually produces this particular stimulus and this particular shock event. Okay, so now what effect does that have? What you see here is in the absence of the stimulus, if you're looking at responses per minute, all right, in the absence of the stimulus, you see an ongoing rate of behavior, okay, and as we increase the electric shock, right, you see this suppression happen very quickly. Up here you don't see it, but as you start increasing the shock intensity, now that FR1 is producing a more intense electric shock, and that stimulus, it's having a suppressing effect. Now what's interesting about this is in looking at the condition suppression effect, right, you see this ongoing rate of behavior, and now you introduce and change the experiment so now that all you're going to do is present the clicker and key color change, but you no longer follow it with electric shock. Well, when you first introduce it, you get the instantaneous condition suppression effect, the condition punishment effect, right? It comes down. But now it's called condition punishment only in the sense is that you're not really providing the electric shock. And after several sessions, you can see here that the clicking and the light is no longer being paired with electric shock. And look what happens to behavior. It doesn't take long for that behavior to start coming back up to operant levels. And again, this is something to really think about that we're going to talk about in the next session. When we look at the cost involved in delivering punishment, not necessarily only the questionable effectiveness of punishment, in the long run certainly, and even possibly in the short run not being as effective as we would like it to be, but the actual cost is this, is that in order to sustain it, it seems like warnings and condition punishers will only work for a period of time. After a period of time, if those punishing stimuli are not somehow embedded into the natural contingencies, you're probably not going to be able to sustain this behavior reduction in the long run. Again, this is one of the many reasons why, in fact, we have to really question the use of punishment. All of these data that we're going to be going over now and in the next session really point to one important variable, is that we could have a philosophy which certainly discourages the use of using punishment, but we also have before us a very powerful science that in every way, shape, and form gives us clear experimental data to support the fact that in the long run, punishment is really not a way for cultures to shape up the behavior, survival behaviors in individuals. They have far more problems than they do, and a lot of times we end up resorting to using punishment because we get trapped by our own susceptibility to contingencies of immediacy and impulsive outcomes of positive and negative reinforcement. With that, I'm going to stop, and instead of punishing myself, I'm going to go reinforce myself by making myself a cup of coffee